At a bistro on the Charleston coast, my mother lifted her Bellini and smiled a thin, sharp smile. "If it wasn't for pity," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, "do you honestly believe anyone would have asked you to come?" It wasn't a joke, and it certainly wasn't an attempt at connection. It was a perfectly aimed dart, designed to wound without leaving a visible mark, subtle enough that accusing her would make me look unhinged. My aunt took a slow, deliberate sip of her own drink, her eyes fixed on the harbor outside. "Just let her feel special for once," she added, as if granting a magnanimous favor. In that instant, the polished mahogany table felt less like a place for a meal and more like a courtroom. They were all there, perfectly cast in their recurring roles: the acid-tongued mother, the dismissive aunt, the perpetually joking brother, and me. I was the silent observer, the only one in the room without a script. I just sat there, my hands wrapped around my coffee mug as if it were a life raft, offering a polite smile when the conversation required it, nodding at the punchlines, pretending I wasn't there, but I heard every word with perfect clarity. Welcome to the family bonfire, where all the unsaid resentments are tossed into the flames, and the truth has no place left to hide. Have you ever been in a room full of people who are supposed to be your family, but felt like a complete stranger? They remember you exist when the rent is late, when their credit card is maxed out, when they need a silent backer for a life they can't afford. But the moment you're sitting there, weary and quiet, just hoping for a single look of genuine kindness, you become the punchline. You're the wounded animal they can poke, and you have to pretend it doesn't hurt, because if you dare to flinch, you're too sensitive. Suddenly, you're the one causing the problem, not them. So what are you supposed to do in a family like that, where every act of affection feels like an invoice, and love is a privilege reserved for those who have mastered the art of silence? You stay until the very end, because some revolutions don't start with a bang or a shout for revenge. Sometimes a revolution begins with a single person quietly deciding to let go of the chain they were expected to hold forever. My name is Chloe Evans. I'm 36 years old. I live by myself in a one-bedroom apartment in Denver, Colorado, and my job is to be a financial fraud investigator for a boutique firm. We handle the messy stuff: convoluted accounting, shell corporations, meticulously hidden assets, and the tiny, seemingly insignificant expenses that, over time, can bleed a company dry. My work demands logic, an obsessive eye for detail, and an almost inhuman amount of patience. The irony is, none of those skills have ever done me any good when it came to my own family. In my family, emotion always trumps logic, and fairness? That's a word they only seem to remember when they feel they've been slighted. My relatives are scattered across the state, some in Boulder, a couple in Aspen, others in Fort Collins. But physical distance has never weakened the invisible threads that bind them together, and, in the process, tangled me up. They're the kind of family where, if you ask who's picking up the check, you're met with a wall of silence. But if someone casually says, "Chloe will get it," everyone just nods. No one questions it. No one even looks surprised. For as long as I can remember, I've been the stable one. And in the vocabulary of my family, stability was just another word for liability. And that liability was always, always mine. I was the one who bought my mother's plane tickets for every holiday because she insisted she was too old to understand all that online nonsense. I was the one who booked hotel rooms for my Aunt Carol when she decided to visit Denver because, as she'd say, "You're right there, dear. It's just easier." I was the one who let Leo, my older brother, use my credit card to book a lavish anniversary weekend for his girlfriend because he swore he'd pay me back the second his quarterly bonus landed. That bonus, of course, never materialized. The money never did either. And me? I never brought it up again. I had grown accustomed to being the emergency contact, the backup bank account, the uncredited executive producer of their lives. It started small, a few $100s here and there. Then it escalated to a few thousand. Before I knew it, it had consumed entire years of my life. I used to tell myself that if I just gave enough for long enough, they would eventually start to see me differently. I thought I could earn my place as an essential member of the family, not just be seen as her, the odd one out, the single sister, living alone, with a respectable career that none of them bothered to understand. I spent years clinging to that desperate hope, the belief that devotion could be bartered for affection, that obligation could somehow blossom into love. But the more I gave, the clearer the lesson became. When you're the only one shouldering the responsibility, you're also the only one who gets the blame, when it all inevitably comes crashing down. And then there was the cabin at Lakeview Pines. It was supposed to be the setting for our idyllic family memories, the place where we'd all gather for long summer weekends, grilling burgers in the overgrown backyard, listening to loud music, and letting the kids run wild through the trees. It was a place they all referred to as our cabin, a shared family heirloom. But the name on the property deed? That was mine, and mine alone. Back in 2009, when my father was on the verge of losing the cabin to foreclosure, after defaulting on a high-interest loan, I was the only one in the family with a credit score that wasn't in the gutter. I co-signed the new mortgage. No one said thank you. They just said, good, we get to keep it. From that day forward, every single maintenance fee, every unexpected repair, every insurance premium, and every property tax bill landed in my mailbox. I paid them as automatically as I paid my own utility bills, and they never once asked. They just showed up at the cabin as if it were their birthright. They'd order groceries, leave a mountain of trash, and forget to turn off the heating when they left. A few times, they even lent the key to their friends without so much as a courtesy text to me. And me, the one who had single-handedly saved it from being seized by the bank, who personally rehung the old family photos on the walls, who shoveled the driveway every winter. I never got so much as a phone call to see how I was doing. I existed in that state for far too long, believing I was doing the honorable thing. I told myself that if I didn't step in, everything would fall apart. But the truth, the one I had been avoiding for years, was that they never needed me to do it. They just needed me to take it, and I did. Until that day at the bistro in Charleston, when my mother raised her Bellini, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "If it wasn't for pity, do you honestly believe anyone would have asked you to come?" That was the moment the delusion shattered. I was never part of them. I was a resource, and that was never going to change unless I was the one to change it. That brunch took place at an upscale coastal bistro in the heart of Charleston's historic district, the kind of place with a seasonal menu, cloth napkins folded into intricate shapes, and coffee that cost 4 times as much as it should, but no one dared to complain because of the ambience. My Aunt Carol had chosen the location because, in her words, it was wonderfully photogenic. My mother arrived dressed in a coordinated lavender pantsuit, looking like she was on her way to a high society charity auction, and my brother Leo sauntered in 10 minutes late, laughing at some private joke as if his arrival was the main event everyone had been waiting for. I had chosen a simple cream-colored linen dress. It was plain, clean, and designed to attract as little attention as possible. I was well versed in their unspoken rules. The person who makes the least noise is the least likely to become the target. But on that particular day, my strategy failed. The instant I pulled out my chair, the only one at the table without a little place card bearing a name, I felt Leo's eyes on me. He looked me up and down, then let out a short, sharp laugh. "God, Chloe," he said, loud enough for the neighboring table to hear, "you look like you just came from sorting donations at a thrift store." No one corrected him. My mother didn't even bother to look up from her Bellini, though the faint smile playing on her lips was a dead giveaway. My Aunt Carol coughed lightly into her napkin, a pathetic attempt to hide her amusement, before taking another sip. I sat there, my face a perfect mask of neutrality, smiling faintly as if I hadn't heard a thing. It was a skill I had honed over decades, the art of strategic silence, of nodding at just the right moments, of being agreeable without ever appearing grateful. I used to think that reacting would make me the one who was ruining the mood, the one who was overly sensitive. So I chose not to react. But this time, something felt different. I didn't feel the familiar sting of hurt. I wasn't sad or embarrassed. I just felt cold. A deep, profound cold that seemed to settle in my bones. For the first time in my adult life, I felt no compulsion to forgive them. I felt no urge to rationalize their behavior or tell myself they didn't really mean it. I just sat there nursing my lukewarm coffee, and in the quiet of my own mind, I began to methodically lay out a plan for what would come next. My desire to endure for the sake of keeping the peace had completely evaporated, and I knew, with a certainty that was almost terrifying, that this would be the very last time I would ever sit in the nameless chair. That evening, I arrived home earlier than I normally would. I didn't make my usual stop at the grocery store. I didn't pull into the drive-thru of the coffee shop I frequented for a late afternoon pick-me-up. I didn't even bother turning on the car radio during the long drive back from the airport. I just sat in my parked car for a few minutes, staring up at the soft, warm light coming from my apartment window before finally getting out. Inside, everything was just as I had left it, neat, organized, perfectly in its place. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt hollow, filled with a type of emptiness I hadn't recognized before. It wasn't a sad feeling, it was just the strange, echoing silence that comes after a decision has been made in your heart, even if your lips haven't yet given it a voice. I put my purse down on the counter, brewed a cup of strong chamomile tea with no honey, and opened my laptop. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a new kind of purpose, with no hesitation. The subject line of the email was just 2 words: proceed now. The recipient was Mr. Davies, the attorney who had helped me navigate the messy legalities of my father's property issues all those years ago. I didn't need to add any further explanation. We had broached the subject of selling the cabin a few times in the past, but I had always been the one to back down. I had always said, it's not the right time. That night, the hesitation was gone. As I clicked the send button, I knew with absolute conviction that this time it was happening. Immediately after, I logged into my online banking portal. The family credit card account, the so-called shared pool I had established and managed for years to make it easier to handle their expenses, was the next domino to fall. I went through the list of authorized users, the automatic payments that were scheduled to run, the individual cards linked to the main account. I removed them, one by one, like I was carefully unfastening the last remaining hooks that kept me tethered to them. My hands were steady. It felt like cleaning out a closet I had once been sentimental about, but now recognized it was time to let go. Finally, I opened the legal documents folder on my desktop. It was where I stored digital copies of every important paper, the cabin's deed of ownership, the mortgage agreements, and over a decade's worth of maintenance invoices. Every single document bore my name. Not one penny of it had ever been contributed by anyone else in my family. They only ever called it our family cabin when they wanted to use it. I found the blank sales agreement Mr. Davies had sent me months prior, saved a new version, and renamed the file Lakeview_sale_final. When I finally closed my laptop, it was well past 1 a.m. The city of Denver was still humming with life outside my window, but inside my apartment, an unnatural quiet had descended. I took the last sip of my tea, the chamomile still faintly warm, and had a thought. Maybe, for the first time in years, I had made a decision that was purely and entirely for myself, not because someone else needed me to, but because I was no longer willing to live my life as the emergency contact for people who never bothered to call back just to say they were okay. I didn't make a big announcement. I didn't post a dramatic message in the family group chat declaring my intentions. I didn't drop any cryptic hints or send a warning shot. I simply sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began the quiet, meticulous work of untangling the web they had woven around me for years. I logged into the credit card dashboard, the account I had always used to help out the family, a gentle euphemism for a responsibility that had no end. I looked at the list of authorized users, my mother, Leo, and my Aunt Carol. Each of them had a card linked to their name. Each had their own particular way of using it, their own special brand of self-justification. But not one of them had ever once asked if I was still okay with footing the entire bill. My mother used it for her utility payments, insisting that online banking was too complicated for her to learn. Leo used it for what he called image-building investments, which was his code for expensive clothes, rounds of drinks at trendy bars, and occasionally hotel suites for his latest girlfriend. My Aunt Carol was a more infrequent user, but she still had a habit of ordering things from Amazon to be delivered to the cabin, always with the breezy promise of, "I'll send you the money for that later," a promise she never kept. I had lived in that ambiguous space for far too long. In the early days, I had diligently tracked every single transaction. I created spreadsheets, I took screenshots of receipts, and I would send them to the group chat waiting for someone, anyone, to respond. Eventually, I just stopped. I stopped sending the reminders, and I stopped asking, because I had come to the painful realization that they hadn't simply forgotten. They had just never felt any real obligation to pay me back. In their minds, I was the one with the stable job and no children, the one who should help if she was able. They loved to trot out the old saying, "Blood should support blood." But I was starting to understand that support is a two-way street, not a cliff you push someone off of. I removed each person from the account. With each click, a pop-up window appeared, asking, "Are you sure you want to revoke this user's access?" I was sure. I was more sure of this than I had been of anything in a long time. A small, conditioned part of me still trembled, as if I were committing some terrible betrayal, as if standing up for myself would brand me with the word selfish. But I knew deep down that if I continued down this path, the only person I was truly being selfish toward was myself. Once the credit account was cleared, I turned my attention to the cabin. I opened my personal expense tracker, the digital ledger where I had logged every single bill for over a decade: electricity, water, internet, insurance, lawn care, professional cleaning services. They were small amounts individually, sure, but when added together, they amounted to thousands and thousands of dollars every year. I could vividly remember every summer when they would descend upon the cabin, laughing, eating, and drinking, only to leave me with a trail of mess and a stack of unpaid invoices. No one had ever asked, "Hey, what was the power bill this month?" They only ever asked, "Where did you hide the spare key? I canceled everything, one service at a time, no automatic renewals, no more scheduled payments." I knew the cabin wouldn't collapse into ruin overnight. But after a few weeks without anyone managing the bills, the system would begin to shut itself down. The electricity would be cut, the water would be turned off, and the insurance company would start sending letters with red ink warnings. And if someone in my family decided to drive up for a weekend getaway, they would be greeted by a dark, cold house with a lawn so overgrown it would be up to their knees. No one ever remembers the person who quietly keeps the lights on, the house clean, and the property safe until that person is no longer there. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't even feel sad. It was more like peeling off a very old, very tight bandage from a wound that had already scarred over. There was no sharp pain, just a dull, residual ache. The kind of ache that reminds you just how long you've allowed something to cling to you that should have been let go of years ago. I didn't give anyone a heads up because I knew exactly what would happen. If I had said something, they would have called it a big misunderstanding. They would have laughed it off, sent a few placating emojis, or worse, feigned just enough remorse to make me soften my stance again. They had been running that play for years, and I had always fallen for it. But not this time. This time, I wanted to let the silence be the sole witness to my decision. No warnings, no long-winded explanations, no negotiations. I just waited, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I was genuinely curious to see what would be the first thing to break once I finally removed my hand from the intricate system they all believed I would prop up forever. Leo's credit card at a bar, the unpaid electricity bill at my mom's house, a reservation for the cabin that couldn't be confirmed. I didn't know, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to know, because for the first time in my adult life, I had done something I never thought I would have the courage to do. I had let go, and I had no intention of reaching back. It took exactly 2 weeks. 14 days had passed since I had quietly severed every financial tie, canceled every recurring payment, and stepped away from the invisible web I had been caught in for most of my life, a role that had become an unwritten clause in the contract of being the good daughter and the reliable sister. I wasn't consciously counting the days, but I remember the exact morning that things began to unravel. The first text message came from Leo. It was a single blunt line with no greeting. "Why isn't my card working?" I stared at the message on my phone's screen. I didn't reply. About 10 minutes later, another message came through. "I'm in Vegas. Don't tell me you canceled it." Then the phone calls started. 3 of them, one right after the other. I let each one go to voicemail, and then calmly I powered off my phone. It wasn't out of anger. It was because I had finally heard enough. By that afternoon, my mother had sent a series of messages. The first one sounded composed, almost detached. "The power at my house was turned off. Is there some problem with the payment system?" Then her tone shifted. "The banking app is saying my payment was declined. I don't know how to fix this." And finally, the inevitable conclusion, the line I had heard 1,000 times before. "Can you take a look at it for me?" But this time, I wasn't the one who takes a look. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen table, poured myself a tall glass of cold water, and sat in the ensuing silence. The next day, the family group chat, which had been dormant for 2 weeks, suddenly lit up. My Aunt Carol sent a photo of the cabin. The porch was covered in leaves, the grass in the front yard was nearly knee-high, and the porch light was dark. "Chloe, is something going on up there?" My father, who rarely participated, chimed in, asking why he had received a notice that the cabin's insurance policy had lapsed and that it was now flagged as a high-risk property. I knew then that they were all beginning to feel the void I had left behind, not because they missed me, but because they needed something from me. I didn't reply. I didn't type a single word. I didn't bother to point out that the chaos now unfolding was the direct and predictable consequence of a decision they never believed I had the spine to make. I muted the notifications for the group chat, set my phone on the counter, and opened up my map application. Lakeview Pines was about a 4-hour drive from Denver. I knew the route by heart. Every gas station, every scenic overlook, every winding tree-lined road that led to the cabin. But this time, the drive would have a different meaning. I wasn't going up there to check on something, to fix a leaky faucet, or to prepare the place for someone else's weekend getaway. This time, I was going to say goodbye. I arrived in the early morning just as the mist was lifting off the surface of the lake and the air was thick with the damp, earthy smell of pine needles. The cabin looked much the same as it had the last time I was there. The same familiar dark wood porch, the white-painted window frames now starting to peel with age, the old tire swing still showing the faint scorch marks from a 4th of July when Leo had gotten a little too ambitious with the fireworks. But there was a different feeling in the air. There was no sense of anticipation, just a profound, quiet emptiness, as if the house itself understood that its time was coming to an end. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and flipped the light switch. The old bulbs flickered on, a temporary reprieve, though I knew the next utility bill would go unpaid. I took a slow, deliberate walk through the cabin, letting my hand trail over the surface of the dining table that I had spent 3 long days sanding and refinishing years ago. I looked up at the wall where the family photos were hung, a crooked row of mismatched frames. There was one of my parents, smiling with their arms wrapped around each other. There was one of Leo giving me a piggyback ride when we were just kids. And there was one of the entire family, standing proudly in front of the cabin that first summer after I had saved it. I stared at those smiling faces for a long time. Then I raised my hand and began to take them down. I wasn't rushed or angry. I was methodical, one by one, carefully, deliberately. It felt like I was dismantling a past that I no longer wished to have on display. I placed every single photograph into an old wooden chest, sealed it shut, and wrote on the lid with a permanent marker, "Family, what was?" I didn't intend to throw it away. I just needed to put it away. I knew that the lesson was what I needed to keep, not the evidence. That afternoon, I sat at the small wooden desk by the window where the sunlight streamed through the pine trees and created shifting patterns of light on the floor. I opened my laptop and composed an email to Mr. Davies, my attorney. The subject line was simple: "Go ahead." I attached every document he would need to begin the official process of listing the cabin for sale. I gave him clear instructions to keep the listing private, with no public postings until all the legal paperwork was finalized. I was leaving no digital breadcrumbs for my family to follow. When I finally clicked send, I didn't feel an ounce of regret. All I felt was a crisp, quiet clarity that I had never experienced before. This cabin had once represented a connection that I thought would last my entire life. But I understood now that it was just a house. And no house is worth holding on to if it's the only thing tethering you to people who don't know how to love you properly. I hadn't planned on asking for the money back. Truly, for years I had convinced myself it wasn't worth the inevitable drama, not worth shattering the fragile peace we barely maintained. I had trained myself to let it go, to mentally reclassify unpaid debts as gifts, to believe that preserving a semblance of harmony was more valuable than being treated fairly. But then, something fundamental shifts. It's not because the amount of money becomes too large to ignore, but because the weight of being taken for granted becomes too heavy to carry. That night, I sat at my desk, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating a mug of tea that had long gone cold. I opened a new spreadsheet and typed in a single number, $5,000. I didn't need to dig up old bank statements or cross-reference anything. I remembered the day Leo had called me with perfect, painful clarity. His voice was trembling as he told me he was about to be sued for insurance fraud after a minor car accident. I remembered driving through a torrential downpour to meet with a lawyer on his behalf. I remembered every carefully worded email I drafted, every phone call I made, every time I let out a heavy sigh because I was, once again, cleaning up a mess that I had not made. I even remembered the weak, clammy handshake he gave me afterward and his vague promise, "I'll get this back to you within a month." That was 16 months ago. There had been no follow-up, no check, no text message, nothing. I added a few more lines to the spreadsheet. Outstanding balance $5,000. Due date, July 31st. No extensions, no discussion, no negotiation. I attached the simple file to an email. The subject line read, "Final reminder." I sent it directly to Leo. Then, I forwarded the same email to my mother and my Aunt Carol, not because they were financially responsible, but because I knew they would talk. I wanted the terms to be crystal clear to everyone. This time, there would be no gentle euphemisms, no polite softening of the language, no just a friendly nudge. There was nothing friendly about it. I had carried the financial and emotional weight of this family for long enough. The responses came swiftly. My mom was the first to text. There were no questions, no acknowledgement of the actual debt, just a single dramatic crying emoji followed by the line, "I didn't think you were that kind of person." I didn't respond. I just sat there staring at the message as if it had come from a complete stranger. I had been her daughter, but apparently only when I was compliant, silent, and willing to open my wallet without question. The moment I finally said enough, I ceased to be her daughter in her eyes. That was all I needed to understand just how conditional her love had always been. Leo called immediately after, 5 times in a row. I didn't answer. The final text message he sent was long, rambling, and so utterly predictable that I could have recited it from memory before I even read it. "You're always like this." So dramatic. Why can't we just sit down and talk about this like a family? Why do you have to make everything such a huge deal? It was always the same script. When they made a mistake, I was being too sensitive. When they owed me money, I was being petty. When I stayed silent, I was being cold. And when I finally spoke up, I was the one tearing the family apart. I placed my phone face down on the table. No reply, no explanation, no engaging in the same exhausting, circular argument I'd been trapped in my entire life. On Wednesday morning, I received a notification from my bank. A deposit of $1,000 had appeared in my account. The sender was my father, not Leo. There was no note, no apology, just a blank memo line. A few minutes later, a text from Leo came through. Just 2 words. "We're square." I stared at those words and felt nothing. No sense of relief, no satisfaction, no anger, no joy, just a hollow emptiness. Maybe it was because, for a fleeting moment, I had allowed myself to hope for something more than just a transaction, a simple acknowledgement of the truth, a sliver of basic respect. But they couldn't even give me that. Because in their world, I had never been a person with feelings. I was a function, a machine that fixed problems, a walking ATM, a backup plan, a her only when it was convenient and otherwise just a thing. But at least this time, I had done something I'd never had the courage to do before. I had said no. I had set a boundary. I had forced them to return what they had once assumed they could take without consequence. Not because I desperately needed the money, but because I needed to prove to myself that no one else would ever get to define my worth for me again. And I learned that when you stand firm enough, sometimes your silence can become the loudest voice in the room. That final email didn't happen in one go. It took me 3 full days to compose. I spent hours compiling a comprehensive list of every single account, every service, every financial obligation I had ever put in my name for their benefit. I wasn't relying on the hazy mental lists I used to keep or the scattered sticky notes on my refrigerator. This was a cold, detailed breakdown: electricity for the cabin in my name, the internet contract in my name, property insurance for the cabin, under my name since 2015, after my dad's credit score plummeted. I remembered every frantic late-night call asking for a password. I remembered every time Leo had said, "I'm slammed at work, can you just handle this? I'll pay you back tomorrow," and how that tomorrow never arrived. I wrote with stark clarity in the email. All of the accounts and services listed above have now been canceled. As of this moment, there are no remaining financial connections between myself and any other member of the family. There was no angry rant, no long-winded justifications. None were needed. My final sentence was short, simple, and perfectly unambiguous. I am no longer the one carrying this load. Then I hit send. It was 1:12 a.m. My apartment was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat there in the dark for a long time afterward. No music, no tea, just me, with my hands resting flat on the table. My heart didn't feel lighter, but it didn't feel heavy anymore either. It was as if something inside me had finally clicked shut. Not a door, an entire chapter. I didn't expect a reply, and I was right. None came that day. The group chat remained silent. No angry emojis, not even a half-hearted, "Why would you do this to us?" They were completely silent. It was the kind of silence that only comes from people who know that if they speak, they will have to confront a reality they have spent years actively ignoring, the reality that they had relied on me, and I was no longer there for them to lean on. 2 days later, there was a knock at my door. I was in the kitchen, my hands still damp from washing dishes. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor, but then came a second knock, firmer and more insistent. I dried my hands on a towel, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. It was Leo. He looked different. He was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt. His hair was unkempt, a far cry from the polished, put-together version of himself he so carefully curated for social media. He was holding a brown paper bag, which I guessed contained a 6-pack of cheap beer. I opened the door, not to welcome him, but because I knew I needed to face him one last time. I needed to finish this. "I'm not here to start a fight," he said the moment I opened the door a crack. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its typical cockiness. "I know you're mad, but we're brother and sister, right? Can't we just talk about this? You didn't have to cut everything off like that." I stood my ground, not inviting him inside. I kept the door just slightly ajar, creating a physical barrier between us. "Siblings don't treat each other like ATMs," I said. My voice was so calm and steady that I barely recognized it as my own. "You say we should talk, but for the last 10 years, every talk we've had has ended with you asking, 'Can you help me out with something?' So tell me, Leo, what's actually left to talk about?" He stared at me for a long moment, blinking rapidly as if he was searching for the old version of me, the one who was always easy to persuade, quick to soften, and simple to silence. But that person was gone. I looked him straight in the eye, not with anger, not with sentimentality, but with a full and sober awareness of the vast space that now existed between two people who once called each other family. "If you need something, you'll have to figure it out," I said quietly, just like I always did. Then I gently pushed the door closed. "And don't come back unless you're bringing something other than another empty promise." The latch clicked shut. There was no pounding on the door, no shouted apologies from the hallway, just the soft scuff of his shoes as he walked away, followed by silence. I stood with my back pressed against the door for a long time. There were no tears. My hands weren't shaking. I felt no sense of victory, just the simple, hard-won truth that had taken me 36 years to learn. Not responding is a response, and sometimes it's the only one that truly matters. I always used to think the most painful part of a broken family relationship was being forgotten, but then I learned that's not true. The real pain is being seen with perfect clarity, being openly and consistently used, and still being treated as if you are completely invisible. And sometimes, the truth you need to hear comes from the most unexpected of sources. For me, it came from a woman I never in a million years thought would take my side. It was a Saturday morning. I was at my kitchen table, reviewing the final version of the cabin's sale contract, reading through every clause one last time before I sent it off to the attorney's office. The sky outside was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a soft breeze was rustling the leaves of the aspen tree outside my window. The apartment was peaceful, as if the world itself was giving me a quiet space to close this chapter. Then my doorbell rang. I walked over, looked through the peephole, and my heart skipped a beat. It was Sarah, Leo's girlfriend. I opened the door without a word. She stepped inside, her hands clutching her purse tightly, her makeup carefully applied, but her eyes red and swollen. She sat down on my couch, her gaze darting around the room as if she needed a moment to process that she was really here. Then she began to speak. "I found the paperwork for the cabin," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was in a drawer in Leo's desk. Everything was in your name. I read all of it. The bank statements, the insurance policies, the tax receipts, all of it. It's been you this whole time since 2009. I didn't react. I didn't flinch or let out a sigh. I just sat there listening, as if someone had finally pressed play on a recording that had been looping in my mind for years. The truth, finally spoken aloud by someone else. Leo told me it was a family property, Sarah continued, her voice growing even quieter. He said he was the one on the deed, that he managed everything, paid for all of it, and I believed him. I was proud of him, honestly. Every time we went up there, I felt like I was part of something real he had built. I posted pictures of it. I told my friends, my boyfriend is the kind of guy who really handles his business. And then I found out it was all a lie. She pulled a thick manila folder out of her bag. It was filled with worn, dog-eared pages held together by a rubber band. I could see my own name clearly printed on page after page. The original purchase agreement, the early loan statements, the insurance policy documents, tax receipts. There was no mention of Leo anywhere. "I'm not here to cause more trouble," Sarah said, her voice trembling now. I wanted to say thank you for keeping that place going for all those years. And I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for believing the lie, for sitting in that cabin and acting like it belonged to someone else. And I wanted you to know. I left him. I can't be with someone who builds their entire identity on a foundation of lies just to make himself look good. She stood up, placed the folder gently on my coffee table, and gave me one last look before walking to the door. "You're not invisible," she said softly, "and I hope, from this day forward, you never let anyone make you feel like you are." When the door closed behind her, I remained perfectly still for a long time. The folder lay on the table, a quiet, solid, undeniable witness. For years, I had existed in that cabin as the silent caretaker, the invisible financier, the one who always stepped back so that others could step forward. And whenever anyone talked about it, they always called it the family cabin, never Chloe's place. But it was me who had kept the bank from foreclosing on it. It was me who had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to fix a frozen pipe. It was me who hung the photos, replaced the light bulbs, and patched the dry rot on the porch. Not because I had a martyr complex or enjoyed sacrificing my time and money, but because I had once foolishly believed that if I was good enough, quiet enough, and useful enough, they would eventually remember me. They always remembered the cabin. They just always forgot the person who was single-handedly keeping it from falling down. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. I initiated a wire transfer for $20,000 directly into my parents' joint savings account. There was no memo, no subject line, no need for an acknowledgement. It was their fair share from the sale of the cabin, even though every single legal document was in my name. Even though I had covered every single cost for over a decade on my own, I sent them the money not to appease them, but to know, for my own peace of mind, that I owed them absolutely nothing. The cabin officially sold early the following week. I received a short email from the law firm confirming that the transfer of funds was complete. I didn't go back for one last look. It wasn't necessary. Everything I needed to take from that place, I had already taken. And everything that needed to be left behind, the manufactured memories, the unwritten obligations, the role I had never willingly auditioned for, I left it all there. I moved out of Denver a few days later. I bought a small house in the foothills west of the city. There's no sign out front, no ties to anyone from my past. It's just me, a few boxes of old books, a sun-drenched kitchen, a comfortable reading chair by a large window, and a small backyard where, for the very first time in my life, I can plant a garden without the fear of someone else coming along and trampling it. On my first morning in the new house, I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching the early morning sunlight filter through the trees. My phone didn't ring. There were no new messages in any group chat. No one was asking, "Can you help me with this?" For the first time, I felt light. Not light in the sense of letting something go, but light because I finally understood that I didn't have to carry anything that wasn't mine to carry anymore. And if someone were to ask me what I lost in all of this, I would tell them the truth. I lost nothing. I simply reclaimed the part of my life that they had all assumed belonged to them. And this time, I'm keeping it for myself. 3 months isn't a very long time if you're waiting for someone to come back, but it can feel like an eternity if you spend every single day braced for some kind of noise, whether it's a new request for help, a passive-aggressive guilt trip, or just a random meme dropped into a group chat you never truly felt a part of. Those 3 months passed as if someone had simply turned down the volume on my entire former life. No one called. No one checked in. There were no messages asking if I was okay, no frantic calls about overdue bills, no half-hearted, "It's all in the past, let's just move on" texts. Nothing. At first, I thought the silence was just a temporary phase. I had learned their emotional playbook by heart. First came the anger, then confusion, then blame, and finally, a superficial attempt at reconciliation. I had played the role of the emotional shock absorber more times than I could count, always absorbing the impact without ever receiving a genuine apology. But this time was different. No one came back. No one tried to fix things. There was absolutely no sign that anyone wanted to reopen the door that I had so firmly closed. They had all just vanished, not because they had changed, but because they had no idea how to deal with a version of me that they could no longer control. I used to think that silence was the most frightening thing in the world. I believed that if no one needed me, if my phone wasn't ringing, then I must be truly alone. But I've come to realize that it was their constant noise that was wearing me down, and this new silence. It was so much gentler than I had ever imagined. I no longer wake up with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, feeling the immediate pressure to check my phone for whatever new emergency I was expected to solve. I don't lie awake at night wondering how I'm going to stretch my budget to cover someone else's forgotten expense. I no longer waste my time drafting polite emails to smooth over mistakes made by grown adults who still behaved like entitled children. Now my mornings start with the sound of the kettle boiling, the sunlight streaming through my kitchen window, and a to-do list that only has my name on it. I've started a garden. I read voraciously. I cook elaborate meals, not because I'm expecting company, but because I want my own dinners to be something worth looking forward to. Some days I blast music and dance by myself in the living room. Other days I just sit for hours, watching the light change on the walls as the sun sets. I'm not just trying to keep myself busy, I'm simply living in a way that I was never allowed to before. Kevin was the only one who remained in my orbit. My cousin, 16 years old, lanky, quiet, with a look in his eyes I had never seen in any of the adults in our family. It was a look of someone who was actually listening. Once a month, Kevin would ride his bicycle over to my new house and ask if I wanted to go get burgers. There were never any probing questions. He never pushed me to talk about what happened. Some days, the two of us would just sit in a booth, eating fries and staring out at the street, not saying much at all. But once, as I was taking a bite of my burger, Kevin put his hand on the table, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "I get it." Just 3 words. No further explanation was needed, but I knew that he really did, because he was the one who had never laughed when the others made me their punchline, because he had never waited until I was useful to him to be kind, because he didn't need a reason to choose a side. He had always been on mine. One afternoon in early autumn, as I was rearranging the books on the shelf in my living room, I noticed a postcard had been slipped under my front door. There was no envelope, no return address. The front was a photograph of a lake at sunset, the light spilling in shades of purple and orange across the still water, eerily reminiscent of the lake near the old cabin. On the back, there was a single, short sentence written in a careful but unfamiliar hand. "We should have done better. You deserved better." There was no name, no signature, no clue as to who might have sent it. It could have been my mother, or Leo, or maybe it was from someone else in the family who had stayed silent for years, watching me get pulled under without ever speaking up. Or perhaps it was from a complete stranger, someone who saw a reflection of themselves in my stories somewhere online and decided to send the apology that my own family never could. I held that postcard in my hand for a long time. I didn't get emotional. There were no tears. But something inside me softened. Not because I had forgiven them, but because I realized I had come so far that I no longer needed their apology to move forward. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't display it on my mantelpiece like a trophy either. I quietly tucked it away in a small drawer with old notes and keepsakes I no longer looked at, not to hold on to the past, but as a quiet reminder that some doors need to be closed, not locked, not barricaded, just closed. Closed firmly enough that you can't be pulled back through them against your will. Freedom doesn't show up with a marching band, with loud arguments, or with victory laps. It arrives quietly, when you finally learn how to be alone without feeling incomplete. It comes when you stop giving pieces of yourself away, just to prove to others that you matter. It comes when you finally choose yourself, without an ounce of guilt. And it comes when you realize that the silence you once feared is actually the only place where you can finally hear your own voice. No one interrupts. No one scoffs. No one asks, "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" My freedom wasn't loud, but it was real, and it was more than enough. So, what about you? Have you ever been in a relationship where you were always the one carrying the weight, always the one trying, always the one enduring, just to keep everything from collapsing? Have you ever given, not because you had extra to spare, but because you thought to yourself, "If I don't do this, no one else will"? And have you ever been called selfish or cold or too sensitive, simply because you finally found the courage to stand up and say, "Enough"? I don't know where you are on your journey. Maybe you're still holding everything together just to keep the peace. Maybe you're still mentally drafting an apology for something that was never your fault. Maybe you're still holding on to the hope that if you're just a little bit better, if you just stay quiet one more time, if you just give a little bit more, that people will finally change, that they'll appreciate you, that they'll finally love you in the way you deserve to be loved. If that's where you are, I understand. I lived a lifetime believing that too. But here's the thing. Some places will never change, no matter how much of yourself you sacrifice to them. Some people only know how to value you when you are useful to them. And some relationships, if you don't find the strength to step out of them, will forever swallow you whole inside the role they have written for you. Not because you weren't good enough, but because you were too quick to forgive, too willing to stay, too accustomed to being the ground that other people walk on. It took me more than 30 years to finally understand this. Kindness does not mean allowing others to walk all over you without a trace of shame. Love is not a one-way street, and family, if it only exists when you are the one paying the price, is not love, it's a transaction. And with any transaction, you have every right to walk away the moment you realize you're operating at a loss. Leave a comment. Tell me about the moment you chose to stop, even if it was just a quiet, tiny number. Tell me how long it took you to realize that you don't have to be the most useful person in someone's life just to be allowed to stay in it. Because maybe, just maybe, your story will be the key that helps someone else unlock their own door. No one is born to be someone's emotional dumping ground, their personal ATM, or the scapegoat for their failures, no matter what title that person holds, even if that title is family. And if no one has ever told you this before, let me be the first. You deserve to be loved without having to pay for it. And you have every right to choose again, to choose your life, to choose your boundaries, and to choose yourself. End of story.